get the impression from your book that civil rights was not at the top of the agenda at the very beginning of the administration.
No, it was not, for two reasons. One, that it had not been one of Kennedy's chief interests. He was more focused on foreign policy and to some extent on making certain that the economy remained strong, because he had not had his exposure to civil rights issues, although he began to talk about it during his campaign. But when he got to the White House, the congressional leaders said that 23 Democratic congressmen had lost their seats in 1960. May have been partly Kennedy's fault, because his religion turned a lot of people against the Democratic Party. And they said, in the previous session of Congress, there had been attempts to have a civil rights bill, and it failed. If it failed in the previous Congress, it certainly wasn't going to pass with 23 fewer House Democrats. And for Kennedy to go through the motions of symbolically sending up a civil rights bill would only antagonize the so-called Dixiecrats, or Southern Democrats, to vote against the rest of his program. Well, the rest of his program that he wanted passed that first year included a lot of provisions to help people at the bottom of the economic ladder, including blacks, minimum wage, stronger Social Security, better public housing programs, aid for economically distressed areas. And why jeopardize the prospects for that legislation, which would actually help black Americans, just to go through the political symbolism of sending up legislation that had no chance of passage?
So it must have been gratifying as time progressed, when you got to the point where it was politically viable to work on civil rights legislation.
The truth of the matter is, it was never politically viable, because JFK knew it was going to cost the Democratic Party the South, and Lyndon Johnson particularly weighed in with that point. And it turns out they were right. We have lost something like the Democratic Party has lost 7 out of 10 presidential elections since Kennedy and Johnson. The only 3 exceptions were Southern governors, Carter and Clinton. And it's because we lost the Southern and border states in almost all of those elections.
Can we say then that the civil rights legislation that you worked on and that was ultimately passed during the Johnson administration was a great act of courage?
Yes, of course it was, because Kennedy knew that it was. I still think, and both he and I hoped that he would still win re-election to a second term, because he gained an enormous popularity in all other parts of the country, and surely some Southern states would recognize his leadership ability and the New Deal economic programs that had done so much to revitalize the South back in the 30s. But yes, he knew it would endanger the prospects of his party.
Let me ask you a little bit about the way things
That's called profile and courage.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, if the book were updated, that seems like that should be a chapter. But I was thinking about the decision-making in the White House, especially early on. People have heard about the Bay of Pigs, and I know that President Kennedy felt that that was not an operation that went well. Feel good about it. What changed in the White House after the Bay of Pigs in terms of the way operations were conducted?
It's a very important question. Since Roosevelt, people get this idea that the real time for showing what you can do when you're a new president, the so-called honeymoon is on. The real time is the first 100 days. Roosevelt talked about the first 100 days. In his inaugural, Kennedy said all this will not be done in the first 100 days. But there was the Bay of Pigs, an operation that had been formulated by holdover CIA and military leaders who had a lot of credentials, gray hair, nettles smart enough to realize that when you're in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. Second, he learned lessons so that a year and a half later, when we had another crisis related to Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, people were different. The procedures for making decisions were completely different. He wanted to know all his options and the pros and cons of each one. The policy was different because he had decided that, as I said to some students at lunch today, you don't solve political problems. Whenever Americans talk rather dismissively in other countries about the need for regime change, that's a political problem. You don't solve political problems with military force. So his whole approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis was completely different. Thank goodness, otherwise we wouldn't be here talking.
Well,
And it was completely different, and the result was completely different.
and that's a good. I mean, obviously, he had people connected to the Cuban Missile Crisis that he had confidence in. And felt
Yes, on that first day, was, I can remember very clearly. It's the only time in my life I remember what day of the week it was when something happened. On Tuesday morning, October 16th, he called me in and told me what the reconnaissance planes, U-2 planes over Cuba, had photographs from 50,000 feet up. It was the beginnings of the Soviet nuclear missile site, and he was calling the meeting later that morning, not for 2 months later after we'd gone back to the ranch to clear brush. Later that morning, not the National Security Council, but those individuals in government whose judgment he wanted and whose recommendations he trusted. A dozen of us or so. The National Security Council has a membership set by statute. And there were some members of the National Security Council whose recommendation he wasn't interested in. And in addition to that, everyone who thinks he's important in Washington thinks he has to attend the National Security Council meeting. And to show he's important, he has to bring along his deputy. And for the deputy to prove his importance, he has to bring along an assistant. And pretty soon the meeting is too big, A, to make the kind of crisp recommendation Kennedy liked, and B, to keep a secret. And Kennedy felt we had a brief advantage because the Russians didn't know that we knew. And therefore, if we could keep the secret, we would have time to work out our response without some preemptive action by them, making public that they had missiles there, panicking the American people, or inducing Congress to press the president into doing something that he did not think was wise.
he was being very calm during this incredible.
He was calm. He was detached. He still had a sense of humor, but the cool way he led that group through our deliberations day and night was extraordinary.
What was your specific role in that group?
Well, if you've seen the movie 13 Days, which is a pretty good, accurate movie, of course my wife says it's too bad Warren Beatty wasn't